Michelle has worked with Bain & Company, been the MBA recruiting director for Deloitte, been with the Wharton School's MBA career management team, not only as a career advisor, but also as the director of the program. And she now coaches and consults with private clients and works with top-tier MBA programs all across the country. And so we're very, very honored to have her here today telling us a little bit about her expertise and insight into creating a compelling resume for today's job market. So from there, we'll go ahead and get started. And Michelle, I don't know that I'm able to share the control with you, so I'll just go ahead and follow along and try and move the slides along as best as I can. Just let me know if I'm making this so.
Sounds good to me. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and it's really my pleasure as a fellow U of C alum to be on the line with everyone, and definitely appreciate the opportunity to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. As Annie mentioned, as a former recruiter myself, I've definitely seen many a resume in my day, and certainly having worked at Wharton, seen not only thousands of resumes, but also talked to many employers about what it takes to stand out in this type of document. So happy to share those perspectives and certainly encourage your questions as we go through the slides. So without further ado, let's move on to our objectives for today's session. So, Annie, are you able to advance the slide?
Hold on. Yes.
There we go. Okay. So in today's session, what I really hope to do is give you some insight into what employers are looking for in a resume, since that is really the key to knowing what's the right sort of content and how to frame things, and then share some best practices for creating a resume that gets you noticed. And lastly, I really hope you'll walk away from today's session with increased motivation and confidence in updating your resume. I know that updating your resume is definitely not on the list of top things that people enjoy doing, and I think a lot of that is because it feels like a laborious task and something that you're not quite sure if you're doing it right. But my hope is that by the end of the session you'll have some practical tips and approach for how to do it, and it'll be less daunting. Okay, so your resume is a critical document. You probably all realize that your resume is the frontline document for your overall marketing message to recruiters or to employers, and it helps you to get the interview. What you may not realize is that it communicates a lot more about you than just the content that's on the page, and it very much shapes what you will be asked about in future conversations and interviews with the employer. So there's sort of a golden rule that if you have something on your resume that you would not want to discuss in an interview, it shouldn't be on your resume. So certainly it's important to think this is a document that will not only be seen through the screening process, but potentially will be used all the way through the interview process. You want to make sure you get the content right. One of the things that I think frequently is a common misunderstanding about resumes is that people feel compelled to make it a historical compilation or a very comprehensive document of everything you've ever done in your work and school history. And it's really important that you change your mindset, if you have that mindset, that your resume is not supposed to be a summary of just your job duties and responsibilities. It's really intended to be a selective set of key accomplishments and success stories that showcase a certain set of skills that are going to be appealing to your target audience. And we'll get into more detail about how you do that in the next couple slides. The last thing about what your resume is not is it being a place for self-aggrandizement or modesty, meaning that we want to make sure that in this day and age of certainly people doing background checks, we don't want to exaggerate things that cannot be verified, but we also want to make sure that we're not too modest. The document is ultimately a marketing document, and it needs to sell what you have to offer, so we also don't want to be too modest in our accomplishments as well. So one of the questions that I frequently get from my clients is what type of format to use. Probably the most common and generally speaking most preferred by employers because it's easiest to read and understand is the reverse chronological format. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it, where you simply list your most recent employment experience first and then go in reverse chronological order. Certainly the structure works well if you have a steady work history and you can readily demonstrate experiences that are relevant to the target job that you want. The next format is the functional resume format, which doesn't list the employers per se and then key bullets under each one, but it actually will have subtitles or headings that are functional or skill-oriented in nature. So it may say project management experience or financial operations experience, and then it will have bullets underneath that heading that can come from any of your employers, and so that it really focuses on sort of the key skills that you have within certain buckets. The challenge in this is that it does get somewhat confusing for employers because they cannot readily see which employers you worked for when, and it's not in a chronological order. So this approach, though, can actually be helpful if you have several gaps in your employment or you change jobs frequently and you don't want there to be a red flag around, why is there a 3-year gap here, or why does it seem as if this person has had a different job every year. This type of structure can help to mask some of that. Now, that being said, I think the trade-off is that anytime an employer sees a functional resume, they are thinking potentially, is there something to hide, and they may scrutinize the dates a little bit more closely. So, again, I think it can help with that. And generally speaking, I think I recommend it more if you have developed significant or relevant skills outside of your employment, so potentially in extracurricular activities or nonprofits that you've been involved with, that will be better showcased in this format because your direct work experience or your paid full-time work experience does not necessarily showcase your most relevant skills. The last structure is sort of a combination of both the chronological and functional. So it uses the reverse chronological structure, but then within each employer you have these functional skills subheadings, such as strategic thinking or analytical problem solving or communication skills. And by using those headings, you are able then to kind of highlight or showcase certain skill sets that you want to pop out or to jump out at the reader. It's definitely, I think, something that's effective for career switchers because it sort of signals what's transferable or relevant about what might appear to be an unrelated type of job. So if you're trying to switch industries or functions, you can then use these headings to kind of call out what is transferable and relevant. And so that, I think, again, sort of raises less flags than red flags in the functional format. And so I would certainly consider this type of format if you are a career switcher. So the formula for our standout resume, as we mentioned before, the resume is a key marketing tool, and so the key is really to adopt your customer's perspective. And so a standout resume will showcase your relevant and transferable skills. Can you click to the next slide, to the next, just hit, yeah, thank you. A track record of impact and success, and your ability to produce a flawless end product. And we'll spend a little time now talking about how you showcase each of these. So in terms of relevant and transferable skills, put yourself in the shoes of your target employer. What is it that they want to see in their ideal candidate? And what they want to see is someone who appears to have invested in the appropriate amount of research in the process, and that really someone that understands what the job is and what it's going to take to be successful. So activities that you can do to really get a better handle on what it is that they perceive is ideal in a candidate is to analyze the job description, obviously, but also analyze just job descriptions of related type positions, maybe not from this employer, but from competitors and things like that, to get a sense of what does it take to be successful in this function or in this industry. You want to obviously leverage any networking conversations you've had with maybe current employees or past employees that work at the firm or work in that function to understand what is valued in a candidate for this type of role. And remember to focus on both skills and personal attributes. I think that oftentimes my clients are MBA alumni or other clients that I work with will focus very much on the skill set that they have, but they fail to kind of include also what are some of the personality traits or characteristics that they can bring to the table, whether it's having a strong work ethic or sort of a team orientation or being highly collaborative. These are things that are also valuable in an ideal candidate. So you want to make sure that you are conveying not only just skills, but also personality and character traits that are going to be valued. So again, the shift here is to think about not, how do I just summarize what I've done in the past, but what is it that they're looking for and how can I show them that I know what they're looking for. And one of the ways to do this is use the employer's language. So again, if you have the job description and you can kind of use some of the buzzwords that they've mentioned in the job description or some of the jargon that you've learned from people that you network with that are in the industry or the company, you want to show that you have comprehension of kind of what they're looking for. And oftentimes there are employers that are using sort of electronic or recruiting programs to sort of sift through or eliminate resume based on specific search criteria. So they'll be looking for certain buzzwords, whether it's certain program or software, familiarity, or it's certain key skill, phrases that they're looking for. So again, as much as possible, use the employer's language to show them that you've invested in understanding what they need and that you have exactly what they need. So be selective about your content. So after you've identified the most desired skills and qualities that you think your target employer is looking for, select 2 to 3 best examples of when you best demonstrated these skills and attributes. You want to highlight relevant industry or functional expertise. And again, for career switchers, use functional jargon and comparable context to show how what you've done in the past is related or is relevant. You may not have done the exact job before in the exact same context, but if you can show that you had used the same type of skills just in a different context, that's sort of the next best way to show them that you're prepared to do the job. And again, you want to showcase only the most impressive experiences. So don't feel the need to have 10 examples of your leadership, but really the ones that are the most impressive. And keep in mind that you want to order your bullets within a given section, so within a given employer. You want to list the ones that you think are going to be most compelling and most impressive towards the top of the section, because people tend to read from top to bottom, and so you want to pull them in and engage them early on so that they'll want to keep reading to the end. But if for some reason they're skimming, as many recruiters do because they're busy, especially when they get a lot of applications, they may not get to the ones towards the bottom. So again, signal what you think is the most important to them by putting that at the top of any sort of section or list. Also remember that more real estate signals more emphasis. So you don't want to take up 3 lines on your resume with an experience or with a success story that is not as relevant as something that is going to be more pertinent that you've only given 1 or 2 lines to. And then also watch out for content that signals a more junior candidate. So again, I think this goes back to not feeling compelled to document everything you've ever done, including when you were an entry-level employee at a given employer. You only want to select the things that, again, are most relevant and impressive, and in many cases that tends to be what you've done most recently at an employer as opposed to what you did in your first year there.
Now, Michelle, I'm going to jump in. We had a question from one of our attendees, and I know you mentioned for career switchers usually using functional jargon. So the question was, does direct experience always trump transferable skills? So, for example, if you're competing against somebody who's been in the industry for years and you're just switching, is that always going to be the case, or is there room for someone to switch?
I think that's a great question. So I'm going to answer with a perennial, it depends. I think there are certain industries, I'll say things like private equity, for example, where it is much harder to break in without any direct experience. So there are a couple of industries where it's going to be much harder to compete, and I don't want to say impossible because anything is possible, but it's much less likely to be realistic to make a switch when there are a large pool of talented candidates that have direct experience. But by and large, I find that a lot of opportunities or a lot of companies are very interested in people that have passion and motivation, and if you have transferable skills. So again, you can show that you've done quantitative analysis, or that you've led teams, or that you know how to think strategically, and those are the types of skills that are needed in the job that you're applying to. And you can prove or show that you have, passion, interest, motivation. It's something that you follow even in your spare time, and that you can speak intelligently about trends and issues that are happening in that industry. That can make up for quite a bit. I think what always helps in those situations is having sort of inside advocates or internal references. So to get recommended by someone who's within the company, and again, it doesn't have to be your best friend, but I think through sort of standard networking processes, by just sort of reaching out to people for informational meetings and then developing a connection with someone such that they'd be willing to sort of recommend or refer you, sometimes that can be enough to just get your foot in the door so that you can at least get that first interview. Sometimes it may only be sort of a courtesy interview out of the fact that an employee, a well-respected employee, recommended you, or it could be that there's a referral program in that company. But many times you can get your foot in the door with passion and motivation alone if you've got that referral. And then it's up to you, once you get in the interview, to really sell them on how it is that you can actually do this job very effectively, and that you'll be a quick learner, and that you can absolutely compete with somebody who has direct experience. Keep in mind that a lot of people who have direct experience sometimes don't really want to be in that career either, but feel like it's the only option that they have, and so they won't bring that level of passion or interest to the job, especially in this market where unfortunately people find themselves with fewer options. It's really going to be important that employers want to see people that are not only able to do the job, but that really want to do the job and are passionate and are going to be excited to come to work every day. So don't underestimate the value of kind of demonstrating that passion and commitment to the industry or the function, even if you don't have direct experience. Does that hopefully answer the question? Okay.
Yep, thank you.
Sure. So the other sort of most common question I get about resumes is objective statements or skill profiles and whether or not those are necessary or important to have. Most of you are probably familiar that this is sort of the section that's at the very top of the resume. The objective statement is often like a 1 or 2 sentence statement about what it kind of summarizes what your qualifications are and what it is that you're looking for in your next position. A skill profile is oftentimes, again, sort of either a listing or a text section around what are the key skills that you can bring to the table. So what I'll say is that there is amongst sort of the recruiting community, there's no universal consensus that you absolutely must have an objective statement or you must not have one. I think it depends on your situation. And what I tell people is, obviously in this day and age, we want to keep the resume as concise as possible. And so it's important to recognize that real estate or space on your resume is extremely precious. And so if you're going to take up several lines, on your resume for anything, you want to make sure that it's really giving you your bang for your buck. So as we said before, objective statements tend to be sort of 1-sentence statements conveying your desired career goals and organization. So some of the cons of an objective statement are that they oftentimes will come across as very egocentric, right? So I'm seeking, a position with an XYZ type of company that will allow me to do X, Y, and Z with my career. So it tends to be more egocentric versus employer focused. And it could limit your appeal as a candidate, because if you've been too specific in your objective statement of what you want, then someone who might be thinking of you for a slightly different role will get the impression that you're not particularly interested in the position that they were thinking of for you. On the other hand, if you make it so broad, it sort of becomes not useful because if it just says, I'd like to gain full-time employment in a dynamic organization, I mean, that could pretty much be any organization. So if you're taking up space with something that isn't meaningful. Now, on the pro side, it can be helpful, I think, if you are a career switcher or you're re-entering the workforce after a long period out of the workforce and you want to use it to really highlight your relevant skills. So, by looking at your resume, it may look like you spent your whole time, your whole career in sort of high-tech marketing or something, and now you want to switch over into brand management. An objective statement can help you very quickly and succinctly at the top of the resume explain what's driving your desire to move into a different industry and to signal that you have the relevant skills. Now, in terms of skill summaries and profiles, again, it's a section that summarizes some of your areas of expertise. Again, the cons can be that, if you're listing out skills, based on what you've done before, it could be backwards facing, or what I say, sort of looking back, and it kind of summarizes what you've done in the past, but not necessarily what you want to use, what you want to do, or what skills you want to use in the future. Again, I think it also can be repetitious to what's going to follow in the rest of your resume. And the skills, ultimately, you can list whatever you want at the top of the resume, but it's not going to be taken at face value that just because you say you have strong, financial analysis skills or that you have excellent communication skills, no one's going to actually believe that unless they see some proof later on in the resume with specific success stories or achievements. So, again, you have to ask yourself, am I taking up space with something that is just repetitious later on in the resume? Now, the pros, again, that for career switchers, it can really highlight motivation and transferable skills more readily. So let's, in the next couple slides, we'll give some examples of what we mean by this. So for an objective statement, if you take a look at the before and the after, I think this is a very sort of stereotypical objective statement that I've seen with my clients, where it sort of focuses on what the person has done in the past. So energetic and results-driven technology professional and manager with over 15 years of experience in developing hardware and software products. Now, the challenge here is that this is somebody who actually wants to move into a nonprofit or a socially minded kind of organization, but you would not get that from the objective statement that's in the before. And in the after, we have results-driven project manager with over 15 years experience in product design and commercialization, seeking to apply broad functional skill set to develop innovative and sustainable products at socially minded organization. So again, in the after, we're being much more specific about what it is that we want, to develop innovative and sustainable products at a socially minded organization, and we're pulling out the more transferable skills, so product design and commercialization skills, as opposed to saying I've developed hardware and software products, which is not what you want to be doing going forward. Okay, in terms of skill profiles, same thing. If we take a look at the before, we have things that, again, are sort of more backwards facing, 10 years of consumer electronics industry experience, things that are very generic, excellent presentation and communication skills. But if we look at the after, we have things like seasoned leader with 10 years of corporate strategy and product management experience in startups and multinational firms. Now I get the impression, okay, this is somebody that could work in sort of a small firm environment as well as a large global organization. Instead of just excellent presentation and communication skills, we have significant experience communicating with C-level and operational staff, which helps me to understand that you can communicate, with top-level executives as well as potentially, engineers or scientists. And then again, back to this thing about using sort of jargon or things from the job description, adept in ROI, P&L, and financial reporting and budget analysis. These are sort of, financial buzzwords that, again, especially if they're listed in the job description, you want to show that you have exactly what it is that they're looking for, as opposed to being very vague and saying, combination of strategy, finance, and product marketing skills.
Now, Michelle, I'm going to jump in. We have a couple of questions as we're talking about the top of the resume, some kind of nuts and bolts questions.
Sure.
First of all, if you're looking for a job out of state, do you recommend using the addresses of family or friends who may be in that city that you're looking to transfer to?
That's a great question. I think, in an ideal world, you wouldn't have to misrepresent yourself in that way, and I think the best way to combat that is that if you've done networking prior to sort of submitting an application, then, you're going to have some inside connections that are able to kind of articulate on your behalf sort of why it is you're looking to make the move. And I think the cover letter will also give you that opportunity to explain, that after X years living in, the Midwest, for example, for personal reasons or because of a change in a spouse's, work or employer, you're, planning on relocating to the East Coast, within the next 6 months. So, I certainly would look to see if there are more legitimate ways for you to communicate the reason why you're open or interested to, a geographic move. But I think, look, the reality is there are certainly some geographies that are going to be tougher than others. So I'm thinking of the West Coast, for example, where people tend to be skeptical that if you haven't spent time there and actually worked or gone to school or lived there, that you may just be a tourist, in which case, having an address in that location will be more compelling. You just want to be very careful that if you do that, you are able to retrieve messages or pick up communications in a very timely manner for anything that might get sent to that area. But it's certainly in the absence of any sort of networking contacts or any sort of ability to send a cover note to explain the move, then it certainly can be a way to signal that you have some connection to the area. But remember, they are likely to ask you, oh, I see that you live in this particular neighborhood, or I see that you so explain to me how are you able to reside here if you aren't currently employed in this area. So you just want to be careful that you're not going to get yourself caught into a situation where you will appear to be a disingenuous or untrustworthy candidate.
That's great advice. We also have one more kind of nuts and bolts question. Do you recommend using dashes or bullets? Some people have heard that using dashes is a little bit easier to be read by those electronic scanning programs, whereas I think everyone kind of thinks of bullets as being more visually pleasing. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is somewhat subjective. I think personally that visually bullets are more appealing and kind of cleaner and easier to read than dashes. I've obviously worked and talked to a number of experienced hire recruiters. It is, I think for the types of roles that people are going to be applying to and looking at, I'd like to see people focusing on roles where they have either built some internal networking contacts or referrals, And again, if you're trying to apply to a job strictly through a machine or through a program, and that's the only mechanism by which they're going to screen you, you know, the dash is in a small chance that like a dash is going to be picked up more than a bullet. You know, I think those are likely opportunities that are not going to be as appealing, quite frankly, for people that are on this call. And so I think most programs are sophisticated enough now to be able to process bullets. So for me, I personally think that bullets are preferred over dashes, unless it's sort of a sub. You know, if you've got bullets and then you need to have some sub bullets underneath that, then going with the dashes can be certainly acceptable.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so if you're going to include an objective statement or skill profile, just have a couple of tips to make sure you're making the most of the space. Keep it concise. Again, make sure that it's forward-facing and that you are focusing on skills that are needed for the future job and not summarizing skills from your past jobs. Make sure that it's specific and accomplishment-oriented in its language. And again, highlight tangible, provable skills as opposed to subjective ones. I've seen a lot of resumes where people will list things like, you know, I have high emotional intelligence, or I have infectious enthusiasm, or I'm an inspirational leader. Those are things that I think, again, can come across as perhaps a little bit arrogant and things that are better left for the interviewer to detect if that's really true about you. And again, if you're going to use an objective statement, use that as an opportunity to address the rationale for why you want to work for that particular type of organization. Okay, so moving on to the next element of the formula, so track record of impact and success. We'll talk a little bit now about how do you convey that track record of impact and success. So the way you do this is, again, avoid job descriptions and focus on results. So what I never want to see in a resume is a bullet that starts with responsible for X, Y, and Z. Okay, because when you start with responsible for, that means all that you're going to be doing is describing what you were supposed to do on the job, but it tells me nothing about whether or not you were actually excellent at your job or that you were successful in your job. So don't start bullets or have bullets that I could find on the resume of any other person who held the same job description or job title that you had at that company. So as much as possible, you want to focus on results and use what we call the PAR model whenever possible. I don't know how many of you are familiar with PAR. Sometimes it's called SAR as well. But it stands for problem, action, and result. And so what this means is it's a form of sort of structure for storytelling, which is what was the problem or the situation or the challenge that you faced. So for example, you know, with tight deadlines or while departmental staffing levels were at 50%, what action did you take? Or what personal qualities did you demonstrate to address that problem? And then you want to focus on, as much as possible, to quantify or qualify what was the impact of your actions and sort of what resulted. So again, you know, saying things like you took certain actions that successfully completed the project under budget, saving the company $2 million, is a lot more powerful than just saying you successfully completed many projects, right? Because what does that mean, to successfully complete many projects? I don't know if that means that you didn't get fired over it, or you actually were able to do it 2 months earlier than predicted, and sort of $10 million under budget, which is clearly more impressive. So let's go on and continue with this notion of sort of creating this track record of success. As much as possible, convey the scope of what you've done, the magnitude of your work, or the context if exact numbers are not available. Sometimes I have clients who say, well, I worked on this project and it didn't, we didn't actually end up, launching the product, or the product itself wasn't successful. But you can still talk about how you were, you drove the strategy or developed the strategy and the marketing plan for an X million dollar product, right? That had the potential, or that was forecasted to bring this amount of additional profit to the company. So even though it didn't actually result in that, the fact that you were selected to lead that project and to develop something of that magnitude is an impressive accomplishment in and of itself. So again, to the extent that you convey scope, size, numbers, and quantify kind of what you were doing, that's going to help make things more real than just speaking generically. Always start
a quick question.
Sure.
A quick question. Does that also apply? We had a question about somebody who took some time off to explore entrepreneurial options. And so it turned out that maybe that wasn't the best time or the best situation, so now they're looking for another job again, another opportunity. Is that kind of the same thing? Would you recommend them going ahead and talking about what they did to scope out their opportunities and the way they went through that decision process, similar to if a project is out?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, let's go back to the sort of the relevant transferable skills. You know, you would want, I'd have to know a little bit more about what what kind of positions this person is now targeting, but whatever you can pull from that entrepreneurial experience, even if, you didn't end up starting up your own multi-billion-dollar company, think about what are the things that you have learned, or what experiences or expertise do you now have, or what skills did you strengthen as a result of that search or of that exploration. And that's what I would try to highlight. Maybe you did a certain amount of fundraising, and maybe you didn't. Again, maybe you weren't able to launch it off the ground or get it, to be a full-fledged business. But if you were able to raise an impressive amount of money from investors, again, that can speak to your ability to have relationship-building skills or persuasive communication skills. And if those are skills that will be valued by your future employer, it's absolutely worth mentioning.
Great, thank you.
Sure. As I said before, always start a bullet with a skill or achievement-oriented action verb, and avoid repetition in starting verbs. Sometimes I see resumes and there are 3 bullets in a row that start with manage, manage, manage. And so the repetition obviously is repetitious, but it's also, it creates this impression that your job was very unidimensional and that you didn't have a lot of variety or diversity in skills or tasks that you did on the job. So again, try to start with different action verbs for bullets. Now I think, within a given section, try to avoid repetition. Once you move to another employer section, it's certainly, legitimate to kind of use a verb over again. Do not be modest in taking credit for your achievements, but don't inflate them. We talked about that earlier. As much as possible, you want to obviously, if you led something or you co-led something, absolutely, you should absolutely state that, but don't, again, overinflate to the point where if there was a reference check or there was some sort of background check, that you could be potentially viewed as somebody who is not the most honest person. And then in terms of that section at the bottom that sometimes people have, which is sort of an additional information section, I think you can, I think, use that section to sort of leverage non-professional activities and honors. So things like leadership roles that potentially show you as somebody who maybe started the first technology club at your school when it didn't exist before, and as a way to signal that I'm someone who's been passionate about technology from the get-go. Or again, academic honors. There are certain industries that are certainly going to value high academic performance more than others, and so again, know your audience and what they're going to value about your academic honors or your non-professional activities, and let that be your guide as to whether or not you should take up space in your resume for that type of content.
Now, one more question. This question comes from a PhD, and so they don't have the same kind of things that they can do a track record of success on, like save the company $5 million. So would you recommend that they give other kinds of successes, like maybe finishing a PhD in 5 years, 2 years ahead of schedule, things like that? Is that appropriate?
Absolutely, that's definitely appropriate. So I think, right, so to the extent you can show success in your world, as long as it, again, is saying something positive about you. And the example you just gave, to me says this person must be incredibly smart and also hardworking to have finished a program that quickly. And so if that is hopefully accompanied by, some sort of sense of, that you did it quicker than other people do, and you didn't sort of border on failing out of the program, then I think it can be a very powerful statement about the type of character or personality that you have. So, I think that can absolutely be appropriate.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so demonstrating success. So I use this phrase, show, don't tell. So if we look at the before versus the after, it's just sort of, kind of examples of what we've been talking about. We want to avoid language like responsibilities include hiring, training, and managing of large teams, right? These are sort of very general job descriptions, saying that you're successful at meeting customer needs. But if we look at the after, we've broken it up into 2 bullets that are much more achievement-oriented and much more specific about the scope and magnitude of what you've done. So recruited, trained, and managed team of 50 field technicians as young as supervisor in history of department, or managed $3 million cost center allocating scarce resources to complete projects for AT&T and T-Mobile in eastern U.S. Received 82% customer satisfaction rating, more than twice as high as other 2 regions. So I think, again, providing context, I think sometimes we can get very caught up in our own sort of silo of what we know about our world, and particularly if we're a career switcher, someone might look at, if you just said received 80% customer satisfaction rating, might say, well, that kind of seems like B-level work, not A-level work. So having that additional context to help the reader understand that 82% is actually very impressive because it's twice as high as other regions, that's really important to provide that context so that your reader can appreciate the accomplishment that you've made. So make sure that you sort of check it and say, look, if I'm an outsider reading this, am I going to be able to appreciate the magnitude of this success story? Okay, so the last piece is the ability to produce a flawless end product. So again, remember that especially in this day and age where employers are getting flooded with applications and resumes, most of them, generally speaking, spend less than a minute forming a first impression about your resume. And that can, that sort of speaks to they're going to be looking at a couple of things right in the first 10 seconds that are going to form an impression. Number one is sort of like, what is the visual appeal of this document, right? If something is more than 2 pages long, I myself am personally like already thinking, I don't even want to spend more than, I'm not going to look at more than 2 pages of this resume. So ideally, no more than 2 pages, less than one, not less, but what we general rule of thumb would be about 1 page per 10 years of experience, and that can certainly include that experience might be academic or master's degrees or PhDs as well as work experience. I think that there are some of you out there who potentially have more, like let's say PhD-oriented resumes, or have lots of publications and things like that, which are more typical in those types of fields. You'll want to think about, do I need to, you don't need to list, all 50 of the publications that you have been in, but perhaps have a section where you say select publications, and you can say that more are available on request. So again, no more than 2 pages, ample white space, balanced spacing. We don't want to crowd the resume or have the font be so small that I feel like I need a magnifying glass to read it, and consistent formatting. Those of us, like myself, who have looked at thousands of resumes, we are already inherently trained, our eyes are trained to see inconsistency. So if we see margins that aren't aligned, or bullets that, kind of some bullets are more to the left or more to the right than others, or we can, easily see that there are inconsistencies in ending punctuation. Like, there are things that we've already been trained to see very readily. So I can't articulate enough. It's really important to proofread, because employers or recruiters are really well trained to kind of pick up on these kinds of mistakes. And so this goes back to what we said at the beginning, that your resume says more about you than just the content that's in there. Because when you have mistakes or formatting inconsistencies, it conveys that you are a candidate that is careless and doesn't take pride in your work, and that you're someone who's not detail-oriented, which I can't think of too many careers where that is not a highly valued trait. So very important to try to produce this flawless end product.
Now, a quick question. In terms of the length of your resume, is it okay to include a couple of additional items? For instance, if you're an academic, a list of publications, or perhaps a deal sheet if you were in financial services?
So I think, again, it depends on who your target audience is. If you are applying to a position where that's going to be valued, so you're applying for a research or teaching position at a university, then absolutely, then it's appropriate to have that additional page of publications, because that's what they expect to see. If you were applying for a business-oriented job where you're not going to be publishing per se, then that's going to be less important. Same thing with the transaction sheet. I think that if you're an investment banker and you want to stay in investment banking, then that's absolutely appropriate. But if you're trying to move into a different field, think about whether or not that additional page is going to be valued by your target audience.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So just finishing up with the flawless end product goal. Some of the most common pitfalls I've seen are inconsistencies in headings. So kind of in the formatting of headings, so names of employers and schools, degrees, job titles, and dates. If you choose to make all of your company and school headings in bold and italics, then make sure they're always in bold and italics. If you use a certain font size for the job title or degree line, use the same font size throughout. Ending punctuation, so whether or not you have bullets, or if you have periods or don't have periods at the end of bullets, if you are capitalizing or not capitalizing certain, abbreviations, bullet style and size, units that you use, any of those things you want there to be consistency, because it just shows, again, attention to detail. In terms of spelling and typos, I think we've all experienced that when it's something that we've written and we've looked at 10 times, it's hard for us to catch our own mistakes because our brain fills in what we know we intended to write. So don't rely solely on computer tools either to catch spelling mistakes. As we all know, sometimes the word that we accidentally spell could be a legitimate word, and so spell check isn't always going to catch that. And a lot of recruiters will use spell check certainly to catch anything immediate, but you want to make sure that you're not solely relying on computer tools. One of the things that I recommend is to actually go through your resume and read it from bottom to top and read it backwards, because when you read it that way, it's much more likely that you'll catch spelling mistakes because it isn't sort of a logical sentence where you kind of, can kind of quickly skim through it. And also get, friends, colleagues, to review it for you so you get a fresh set of eyes on it. The other thing is wordiness. People oftentimes, run out of space or feel like, how can I get it from 2 pages to 1 page? You'd be amazed at the amount of space that's taken up with what I call empty or filler words. So things like the, and a. These words, if you, were to go through a resume and delete, the 30 instances of these words, you can actually get yourself back at least, 2 or 3 lines in the resume. So that's just something I'll put out there as a helpful hint. So again, remember that employers are often looking at hundreds of resumes for a position, and a mistake on your resume or an inconsistency can disqualify you regardless of the strength of your experience. I know that sounds really harsh, but when there is so much competitiveness for a particular position, I mean, recruiters are looking for easy ways to screen people out. And so if I've got plenty of candidates for a position, I don't feel any remorse to just cut you out of the pile because of something as simple as a mistake, a spelling mistake or a formatting inconsistency. So definitely, as anal as it probably sounds to focus on this, it is very important.
Now we have a couple of questions just about details. So, the kind of paper you use isn't very relevant anymore now that everything's electronic, but what about font size, type of font, things like that? Are there basics that you recommend in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, I don't recommend going any smaller than like 10-point font for most font types. Anything smaller than that starts to feel like I need to bring out the magnifying glass. And you also don't want to go too big either, because when people go with a font size that's, let's say, bigger than even, let's say, 11 point for like main text. So I'm not talking about headings, which can obviously be bigger, but for your main bullets, I think 10 or 11 is appropriate. When it gets bigger than that, I start to feel like, again, I'm reading like the visually impaired version of a resume, and I start to feel like this person's trying to make up for the fact that they don't have enough robust experience, and so they're just trying to like enlarge everything. So I think 10 or 11 point font is appropriate. And I think, just using any of the more conservative professional fonts, whether it's Arial or it's Times New Roman, those, I think work well. We don't want to go too crazy with using really flowery font styles, unless, again, you're applying for something that's, I don't know, like a fashion or something in a very creative industry where that's going to be more appreciated. But we don't want to make it too out of the norm in the sense that, makes it hard for people to read or makes you stand out in a negative way.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so some of the common resume issues that I get questions about, references. So again, you don't need to list references on your actual resume. Don't take up the valuable space. Employers are going to assume that you can provide these as needed. Sometimes I get questions from individuals, especially if they are, again, re-entering a workforce or they're new to the workforce. Do I need to include, or should I include, summer internships or part-time employment? Certainly that can be appropriate to include. Again, if you are new to the workforce and have relatively little work experience, your internships may be sort of your most robust work experience. Or if you're somebody who has been out of the full-time workforce for several months or years, then part-time work can absolutely be appropriate if the experience is relevant. So again, use your guide, use the guide of, would I want to talk about this in an interview? Will I have something meaningful to say about this summer internship or this part-time employment that makes me or positions me to be a stronger candidate for the role? If the answer is yes, then absolutely include it. If it's just taking up space to kind of fill in a hole for what you can do, what you did during a certain period of time in summer when you went to college like 10 years ago, then it's absolutely not a good use of space. Multiple positions in a short time span. So sometimes, obviously, especially in this day and age, many of us have found ourselves either our companies have been bought out or have been restructured, or maybe they've merged with another company. And so, if you have potentially, it looks like you've worked for a number of different companies in a short period of time, and there are sort of legitimate reasons for that. Again, perhaps there was a merger or it was bought out by another company. Provide an explanation. For example, my husband, for example, used to work for, it was called at the time Anderson Consulting, and then it became Accenture. So, whether it's sort of acquired by or, bought by company X, then it would sort of explain why it is that you have sort of two different company names, on your resume. So if you can provide an explanation or notation to counter the perception that you're a job hopper, take the opportunity to do so. For U.S. resumes, and the standards are different for, for international resumes, but for U.S. positions, things like marital status, photos, your age, previous salaries, references to your religion or national origin should never be included, because these are considered illegal questions actually in an employment interview or any sort of employment screening process because of concerns of discrimination. So these are not things that you should feel compelled to at all reveal on a resume.
Now, can you talk a little bit more about what would be more appropriate for international applications and resumes, and what are some general guidelines for applying to international opportunities?
Well, I would say, I don't have a, like a run, we don't have time in this particular session to go through the specifics of any one country. I think there's a great resource out there called Going Global, which, certainly does sort of a country-by-country profile of, in Germany, pictures are standard practice in the upper left-hand corner, and, these are the types of things that are appropriate to list, like marital status and kids and where you would put that. I think the key thing here is to do the research, right? Go onto Google, and there are a lot of good online resources that will talk about what is the standard resume practice of somebody, in that country, and what are employers expecting to see for those types of positions. And obviously leverage your network. There are plenty of University of Chicago alumni that are residing and working in some of those countries, and so take this as an opportunity to network with those alumni to find out, what sort of standard practice in your country and what would be considered appropriate.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So just in closing, as I've kind of alluded to this throughout the session, that, your resume is a critical marketing tool, but it's only one part of the job search equation. And I say that because I think sometimes candidates put all their stock into the resume and say, okay, if I spend, X number of hours developing this perfect resume, then that's really all I have to do to get a job. I'll just send out 1,000 copies of this, and I'll sit back and wait for the job opportunities to come to me. And so I mentioned this only as your resume is very important, but there's a whole other aspect to your job search, which includes, clearly networking and sourcing job opportunities. That's really important to being successful in the job search. And then before you send any resume out, make sure that you ask yourself these questions. In totality, does my document convey the portfolio of skills and attributes that your target audience desires? Does each and every bullet on your resume convey a relevant skill that my employer, my target employer, is going to care about, and do I express it in an accomplishment-focused way? So do I not just say, oh, I'm effective at doing this, but have I proven that I'm effective by highlighting or showcasing an accomplishment? And then have I thoroughly proofread it? Obviously, as you're putting together your resume, there are lots of resources that you can consider, certainly family members, peers, if you have, within your network, people that are working in sort of a target function or industry that you're interested in, they can have a great perspective on whether or not your resume, passes muster. And then, obviously, you can utilize the services of a professional career coach, but also you have access to Annie and to Matt at the University of Chicago Alumni Career Services to have them review your resume as well.
Wonderful. We do have a couple of more questions. As people have just been really fascinated by this topic and really looking for some help. One question we had in the beginning was if you had any suggestions for resumes of job seekers over 50. So I think one thing that I hear a lot is the question, should I include dates? Should I include dates of my graduation dates? How detailed should I be? How can I de-emphasize it? Should I de-emphasize it? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Again, I think a lot of this, it depends on a couple of things. One is what's the industry that you're targeting and the type of positions that you are targeting. I think that, having more years of experience isn't always a bad thing. And so, I know that while there is this perception that, okay, if I've reached a certain age, this is potentially going to be held against me, think about it in the context of what types of roles or positions you're looking for. I think that if you're trying to get an entry-level position at a consulting firm and you're 50 or older, that's going to be a really hard sell because, generally the average age of the type of person they're hiring for that entry-level position is much younger. So if that's the situation or the case, again, I think it's much more important to not rely on this one piece of paper to tell your story. I think this is where, if you are someone who is struggling with sort of an age, the perception of age discrimination to some degree, this is where the networking becomes very important, where you need to actually have conversations with people over the phone or in person for them to see what's appealing about your background that will make them want to give you a chance, more so than if they just looked at a piece of paper and didn't know you personally. So think about what are the concerns that people have about candidates that might be older or more experienced. Are they going to be flexible enough and adaptable to work in our environment, to essentially learn new tricks, if you will? Are they somebody that's going to be able to get along with and potentially report to somebody who is younger than they are? Right? Are they going to have issues with hierarchy or having to report to someone who's had fewer years of work experience? So those are the types of concerns people have. So your job is to directly address that, and you can certainly do that in some cases in the resume. Again, to show your flexibility and adaptability and ability to work in potentially an environment filled with younger colleagues. But I think the best way to overcome that is through direct networking, so that people are speaking on your behalf and telling people on the inside, this is not going to be an issue for this particular candidate.
And one last question before we wrap up. So if you have on your resume a small employment gap, but you were able to fill that gap with some different consulting projects, different things that you worked on, but yet the gap still isn't very big and the projects maybe don't necessarily warrant the full real estate on your resume, do you recommend going ahead and putting them on, or would you leave them off, or would you maybe pick and choose depending on what position you're applying for?
Yeah, well, definitely, definitely want to pick and choose depending, again, thinking about your target audience. One of the things, again, depending on how short the gap is, once you get to a certain, I think, level in your career, it's no longer necessary. I think people often feel pressure or compelled to put like months and years in their date headings, and I think, certainly after you've completed a graduate program or you're, let's say, 4 or 5 years out of full-time work experience, just listing years and not listing months is certainly appropriate. Again, in any sort of like job application, if they want months, they'll get detailed information when they do the background check. But by then, you're hopefully, again, they're already considering you for an offer. So on the resume, feel free to just use years, and sometimes that can be enough to mask, if you will, a 9-month employment gap, right? So, something less than a year or even a year can potentially be hidden by using that format. If it is longer than that and it can't be masked with those dates, I think that, to your point, if there's something about that time that you were a consultant or an independent contractor that is relevant in your story about why you're a great candidate, does it show something about your entrepreneurial spirit and your ability to take initiative? Does it show something about your risk-taking profile that is going to be attractive to your target employer? Then absolutely, it's worth, even if it's just listing it as, your name, independent contractor for this period of time, and you only devote one bullet to it that kind of summarizes what sort of the key skill or accomplishment that you had while running that, that can be sufficient. So, I think you have to balance the red flag that's created by a perceived gap with what's the value of the content you can put on there. But again, think about it again. If you're sitting in an interview and they say, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume, are you going to want to mention this gap and what you did? And if there's something positive you can say about that time period, then I would include it.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and wrap up now. We've just hit 1 o'clock, but we still have more questions that we weren't able to get to. So if anybody on the line still has questions, please feel free to reach out to me. You can email me. My email address is on the screen there, whitea@uchicago.edu. If you have any questions for Michelle or would like to consider maybe working for Michelle or working with Michelle since she has so much experience, please feel free to reach out to her. I will send out contact information on her website as well, so you'll be able to reach out. And if there's anything else that we can do for you, just let us know. We have another webinar coming up in February on networking, and I know Michelle referenced having networking as a big part of your strategy, so please look at that and join us for that. But thank you so much, Michelle. We really appreciate you coming and sharing your expertise and your insight with us, and we appreciate it very much. Thank you.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right. Take care. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.